Okay, I'm going to bring the meeting of the Planning Commission of Sebastopol to order for June 11th, and we'll start with a roll call.
Commissioner Unger, Commissioner Burns,
Here.
Commissioner Fernandez,
Here.
Vice Chair Hanley is absent today, and Chair Fritz.
Here.
All right, so we have 4 members in attendance with 1 absent.
And can someone let me, I'm not allowed to share my video. Someone let me. All right. Thank you. Moving on, we have comments from members of the public for items that are not on tonight's agenda. So if anyone from the public would like to make a comment on something that's not on the agenda, then now is your opportunity. And since we have no one in the room, we will go to Zoom. And I see 1 hand raised. I say 2 hands raised. Let's start with Magic. You want to unmute yourself and make your comment? Is Magic able to, can someone help her?
Okay, now it should be, all right. Hi, this is Magic Altman. And, you know, as you all know, we just saved the bunya tree again. And now they have chosen to go down there and excavate all around the root system. Actually, I have photos of it. They went down 18 inches. They took all the topsoil and moved it away, so that's not coming back. And my Julian Thorne is an arborist, and he went and took these pictures, and they have taken the first 8 inches, which is where the feeder roots are, which absorb 50% of the nutrients of the tree. So did they get a permit to do this? And if so, who gave it to them and why? Is John Jay here?
Yes.
Okay, so I've been communicating with you. You're the one in the striped shirt, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so I would like you to respond about this. I've been trying to get some answers about who's taking care of the mitigation of this tree. And this is very disturbing because, you know, even though they're not cutting it down, if you wreck their root system, it will gradually kill the tree. So I think we also probably need a tree appraiser to come in and find out what damage they have done and why this has happened, which is just appalling, frankly. So many people love this tree, and we were so happy to hear that it was saved. And now look what's happened. So, so we need to really look into this and figure out what we can do to mitigate and repair what they have done and why they are doing this, and if they had any right to do it. I'd like to know all of that. So please let me know ASAP. We're also in touch with the media, and hopefully we will get this, fixed. But, you know, already they've taken topsoil away that isn't coming back, and this is just wrong. And I would imagine illegal according to what we're doing. I mean, the rights of nature say that that tree has the right to exist and to thrive, and now look what's happening. So thank you for your time. Please, let's deal with this as soon as possible so they don't do any more damage than they've already done.
Thank you for your comment. I don't see, do we have someone's timing? I see it, and Susie's not here.
Yeah,
Oh,
I have a timer going.
Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't see it on my Zoom screen, so, okay, thank you. Next, is that Linda? Do you have a comment to make, Linda?
All right. So in response to Jack Tibbetts of St. Vincent de Paul threatening to sue the city of Sebastopol, I, as a nearby neighbor of your RV village, rise and shine, am suggesting to you that, in fact, it is the city, my neighbors, and the nearby businesses that ought to be suing you and saves for the blight, the theft, the crime, drugs and the deaths that you, through misrepresentation and mismanagement, have brought to this town and this neighborhood. You had every incentive from the beginning 2 years ago to ensure that this $1.3 million project would be a success after my neighbors raised $35,000 in short order, hire a lawyer to prevent the RV village from happening. And they foresaw what would happen, and what did happen was that the Morris Street residents and all of their problems moved from near the Barlow to near the Redwood Marketplace in my neighborhood. In the ensuing 2 years, with your and SAVE's lack of oversight and your mismanagement, there have been at least 3 fentanyl overdoses, 4 deaths associated with RV Village, 2 of whom were women who supposedly hung themselves nearby, rampant drug use, and a crime wave that has left 4 businesses in the shopping center vacant, thus depriving the city of much needed revenue and depriving the neighbors and the shoppers of safety that we had before. Burden of your failure and mismanagement in dealing with this population fell to our wonderful exemplary cops and fire department to fulfill what was your responsibility. We've had 3 cops quit recently, including the police chief, all of whom are now working for Rohnert Park. The city cannot afford more of your demonstrated incompetent and management failure, resulting in the financial, physical, and social disaster that your project is and promises to be. We cannot allow them to continue this kind of a behavior, with the construction of 22 units there for the identical same population, most of whom, I'm sorry to say, have criminal records and continue.
Wendy, you
continue
have
to.
about 30 seconds.
Well, that's the point, that all of the Lucky's, if you talk to any of the stores, Lucky's, the hardware store, those people are being terrorized, and so are the neighbors here by these people who will be the same residents if you allow this project to be built. So I'm asking you, please, do not allow it to be built. We've got a lot more to lose in the long run.
Linda, that's 3 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you for your public comment. Next, we will go to Adam. Adam, can you unmute yourself?
Chair, I don't see his hand up anymore.
Yeah, I see his hand has gone down. Okay, then I will close public comment for items not on our agenda. Next item, we have statements of.
Can we
Oh, yeah.
just address the tree question issue?
Well, we're not really. It's public comment on things that aren't agendized, so I don't think we're supposed to be talking about.
I mean, just we usually when people do comments, we usually have the staff respond or.
Sure, I can update real quick.
Yeah, sure.
I did reach out to the Barlow and the building department as far as that activity has gone. There was an approved demolition permit for the building that is there. Demolition permits do not go through the planning department, so there was no review from either myself or Zuzi in that regard. But I have reached out to the applicant to get a better understanding of if there was any arborist consultation before that work was done. I have not heard back from them. I did send that email out to them this afternoon, so I'm still waiting to hear back for that specific comment.
Okay, so we will move on to our next item. I'm assuming we have no conflicts of interest since this is just training for our regular agenda items. We have a set of minutes to approve from May 28th. And I did have a comment to fix. I'm pretty sure Carrie was not here.
Yep, I was going to mention that. Thank you. I knew you were going to catch it. So
Other than that, are there any comments, Kathy?
No comment, but I would move that we approve the minutes with that edit.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank
Okay.
you.
And Commissioner Onger,
Yes.
Commissioner Burns, and Commissioner Fernandez,
Aye.
and Chair Fritz.
Aye.
All right, so that motion passes with 3 ayes, 1 abstention, and 1 absence.
Thank you. So we have no public hearings tonight, and our first agenda item is to discuss the future walking tour. Staff want to give us a little background on this?
Yeah, so this is in response to some of a couple of the commissioners have raised this as a future project that the Planning Commission would undertake. We have done something similar with the Design Review Board, where we've looked at past projects and looked at their success throughout town. And the walking tour would be subject to a specific area, part of town, during one of these evening meetings this time of year when it's a little bit easier to get out with the daylight being longer. The other component of it that staff is recommending as well is the City of Sebastopol Planning Department was awarded a Priority Development Area grant. And this is a grant that looks at the 116 corridor with potential a workforce housing overlay district. So we would be looking at the kind of commercial corridor of 116 and looking at how we can best streamline permitting processes and things like that. As you're aware, if a project that is located within any of our commercial districts wants to do a 100% residential that is not an affordable housing project, it does require a conditional use permit. We have approved a few of those recently, as recent as last year, and staff has kind of received comments from commissioners that process could be streamlined a little bit easier on something that we would, the commission in general would be supportive of. So we're looking at kind of two things here and merging them together in the future. So looking at the future walking tour and how it could coincide with the Priority Development Area grant. One of the kind of specific areas that we discussed in the grant application is the Redwood Marketplace. I know that that's kind of the north entrance into town, and looking at what types of development opportunities could happen there. So that could be, a starting point. I know Paul has mentioned to me about, certain areas of High Street and Main Street, and then just, throwing it out to the commission as far as any other parts of town that, we look at currently, that use may be not allowed in that district or is a non-conforming use, but, is it really detrimental to the neighborhood, or does it add, a good character to the neighborhood where we would want to allow more of that type of construction? So kind of starting that process. And then that would also kind of lead into our zoning fix-it list of items, which is a part of the Planning Commission's work plan to complete. So with that, I will conclude my report on this item and then kind of just open it up for the Planning Commission.
Thank you. So it sounds like there's sort of several components. There's looking at past projects, looking at this PDA area, and then looking at other kind of, some of the things that I had suggested when we talked, John. Does anyone have any feedback on doing any or all of the above, or Everett?
Yeah. Would the plan be to do it all in one day? Oh, just to kind of spread out?
No, I would, depending on the schedule, depending on what area of town that we look at, it could be separated out in a couple meetings throughout kind of the spring and summertime. We could look at something a little bit more robust where it's a longer meeting period. I would it'd probably be safe to say that if we did look at, a shopping center like the Redwood Marketplace, that would be at least, that specific location for a 2-hour time frame. If we did a walking tour down High Street and Main Street, that could look at a multitude of different areas. So,
would we have to actually hold a meeting, right?
correct.
Public,
Yes.
Just
Yeah.
go through that. Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe the library might be available
Mhm.
for that, but I don't know if we'll get attendance. We could just do it out in the parking lot. I don't, what was the idea behind?
Yeah, I
how
mean, I think it'd be like when we done the parks.
Yeah.
Then we
Yeah.
we convene a meeting when
Yeah.
we're in the park, and if there's any members of the
Yep.
public that want to participate, so we can just start it.
And it wouldn't be
Yeah.
virtual, right? Obviously.
Obviously, and yeah, it wouldn't be
Yeah.
virtual at that point. We wouldn't have a Zoom component. We'd just be in person.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would be in person only. We would notice agendize the meeting as, a walking tour. We would have a starting location. If we did have specific locations that we were going to, we would list them in the agenda. And then just like any other meeting, we would go through the same agenda items. So roll call, minutes, anything like that. It would be the same format.
And I'm assuming it would be a meeting that there's nothing else. I mean, you're gonna have to find something that's open, or were you thinking about doing a special meeting or just regular schedule?
It could be one of the two. It's really up to the commission on how you would like to move forward with that. I think, if we have time in between meetings and projects, there's not a whole lot going on. We could look, forward, looking at the forward agenda, which is part of the, staff and working with the chair as far as looking at those types of things. We can coordinate something, and then, if we have a meeting date, reach out to all the members to make sure that they would be available, and then we can agendize it in
Okay.
that fashion.
If I could, through the chair, I think it would be important to get kind of a sense of what you're interested in looking at. So for example, as John mentioned, we have the PDA grant, and so that's a defined area of focus. And then, Chair Fritz, as you mentioned, kind of looking at past projects, what's working, what's maybe not working, or other areas of concern or interest. And so as we get kind of a sense of what you'd like to focus on, then I think we can look at how to schedule, how to focus certain topics and schedule meetings. And then we do have the PDA grant. And so as part of that, in terms of that scope of work, there will be a public engagement component. So, your thoughts would, feed into that as well. But I think, as you mentioned, Chair, past projects, what are you noticing throughout town that may be working or not working? In terms of the PDA area and the overlay that John mentioned, trying to bring housing, streamline, kind of improve that process. What sites do you want to look at? We can receive that information and then discuss, like, how do we break that up? How do we, create meetings in a timely manner to feed into the PDA process, and then also just make it workable for you in the community?
Thank you. Any other thoughts about?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Redwood Marketplace would be a good one to include, and maybe, try to include one or two during regular meetings if there's nothing going on, and maybe interject a special meeting, just so we can kind of don't have to always use a regular meeting where there might be other business to do.
Kathy, any thoughts?
Yes, I support any and all of the above that you've mentioned.
Debbie, any thoughts about doing a walking tours or?
I got what you guys. I think it's really important. I think it's really important to look at past history, what worked, what didn't work, so we know moving forward, and giving us. I support the walking tours.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I've been advocating for this for a while, and I think it's probably a couple different sessions at least. We don't have just in terms of the time, and it's not a big town to take too long to walk from one end to the other, but given we'll be having conversations along the way and discussing things. I think, doing specific areas. And I definitely had an idea of, kind of, it wasn't even necessarily looking at past projects, but also looking at just, I guess they are technically past projects, but looking at the things that we no longer allow that seem to work, like the older neighborhoods and Main Street, for example. Main Street could not be built today, with our current zoning code. And is that good or bad? And things like that. Just, I did one of the Sebastopol walks a couple months ago called Walkable Sebastopol, and we did a loop through town looking at what makes good and bad walking environments. And it was actually very interesting for myself. I mean, I planned the walk, but as we were doing the walk, there was a lot of things that I noticed between older neighborhoods and newer neighborhoods that you can see the newer neighborhoods respond to the current zoning, but in many ways they're kind of not as nice walking environments. And so that's something that I definitely want to sort of think about, like, bigger setbacks and wider streets and all these things that don't make it as nice of an environment to walk around as some of the older neighborhoods where most of the houses, don't comply with the zoning code because they're too close to the street or for a variety of reasons. So anyway, that's something I'm very interested in kind of pursuing. And I think that we can see a lot of it on just a simple loop, like John said, down Main Street and doing a loop up High Street. And some of that could include, because I know Main Street, South Main Street, as part of the PDA, because that's a commercial zone that only allows 100% housing with a use permit. So that can maybe be combined into one walk. But yeah, I would love to, sit down with staff and maybe hammer out some different routes or itineraries that we could do. And I would be, the preference would be to do in a regular scheduling meeting time, if we have open meetings available, that we're not conducting other business. It's hard enough to get us to come to a regular meeting time, and trying to find a special meeting time may be even more difficult. So that would be my preference if we have some open time this summer to do that.
I think what would be helpful, and you touched on a few of these things, Chair Fritz, in terms of, development standards. For example, you're talking about setbacks or land use, and to give us as staff examples and locations, and you mentioned routes. So in terms of preparing an itinerary, it would be kind of important to, well, what topic areas should we focus on, and where might we find examples for discussion, so that the staff can kind of put together a route, because it'll be a public meeting, kind of a route and maybe locations where, let's say, setbacks are a focus, for example, or land use. And so we can have, as maybe you did with your walking tour, kind of points where you stop and talk and discuss. But, working with you all to kind of, well, what are the topics? What are the routes? And then put together an itinerary that we can then use to establish those meetings, something like that. How would you suggest going about that?
I have very specific examples that I could give you if you want me to do it now, or we can do it separately, in a separate, with just chair and the staff.
We could do it that way, but we would
Sure.
like to hear from, all the commissioners.
I feel like one big component that we're missing, which is interesting because we were talking about this, and John, you and I have spoken about it, is like where we've come from and where we're going as a town. And I think making, I'm always a big let's work backwards kind of person. So if we look at like what the world is going to look like in 10 years, as far as like what will our population look like, what will the climate look like, I think I know how hard it is to wrangle all of us, but I think it would be really great if we could do a walking tour when school is in session and during, any type of the day where there's a lot of congestion. Because I think one thing as a town that we're not looking at is, things that when our master plan was written weren't really a part of our reality. It was done before the Tubbs fire, so we weren't really thinking of evacuation, what the traffic is like, water supply. I mean, it makes me so nervous with the new construction going in at that end of town. Like, so where's the water and how does a fire truck get in and the people get evacuated, and our corridors, there's very few. So I think we really need to look at some of the bigger issues as we evolve as a community, and how do we want to be resilient, and look at like things that did work and things that will also work in the future and things that didn't work, because there's just a whole new concept, I think, in planning that wasn't really part of anybody's reality. Although we all talked about it a little bit here and there, it's like we have much more on our agenda and on our plate that we have to look as a community as we're walking around than just like setbacks and is it comfortable and where are the bike paths, and this is like, how do we get our people out safely? How are we using these streets? How are we, so I just think that would be a great thing if there was any way that we could get together at a really congested time in town and take a look at the usage and the flow as we're planning the future, to kind of get an idea of like what kind of system or structure would be the safest and most.
Kathy?
It just seems like you're proposing a different type of walk on a different topic. I think what Paul Fritz is talking about is something that he's been working on and has specific ideas that he'd like to share with us. But, if you want to come up with that tour and those experiences, I think that's also valid, but not on the
I
same time.
apologize. I didn't hear that. Like, I didn't get that it was a specific. Okay.
That's fine. I mean, like I said, I've been, talking about this for a while. But I think that's certainly, I think your points are certainly valid as well. And, I think, again, that there may be a lot of different walks here to
There
talk
could
about.
there could be. So I think that, Chair Fritz, you have an idea, and that may be more directly applicable to the PDA grant. But these other topics certainly are something that we could take a look at. And as you said, Chair, there could be multiple walks. So, getting your feedback, all of your feedback, and then kind of brainstorming a little bit, how can we kind of put this together and address these issues? Because going forward, it is important, to look at the zoning code and various codes and policies to see if they need to be adjusted to address our future, the city's future. So, we'll receive your comments and then, be happy to meet with you, Chair Fritz, and kind of fine tune maybe a particular walk, and yet at the same time, other comments, kind of receive them and see if we can't put something together in addition. And the idea too of congestion, I mean, I'm relatively new, as you know, to the community. I've lived in the area for a long time. But, congestion, I really see as I travel in and out of this community at various times of the day, it's very different in the downtown area at different times of the day in terms of moving around and the feel because of traffic congestion. So, seeing that, experiencing that and whatnot is important, I think.
That's totally fine. Yeah, and I think that I guess one question I would have is, does anyone have a specific project that we have reviewed and approved that, I mean, I know design review has done this, and it's much more kind of obvious for design review, like a building gets built and they want to see like what was built. It's a little bit more abstract, I think, for some of our things. I mean, especially for some of the use permits, and we don't really need to see the Pilates studio use permit that we approved, or, the storage, the dog bath or the mini storage, or, there's some things that we approve that I don't think we need to take a look at, but I'm just wondering, is there any project that's been built recently that we want to like review as a project, like, oh, was this an appropriate project for us to approve? I mean, we haven't really done any big development sort of stuff that we
Yeah, that's correct. I think the only one that's kind of on the radar for me, and obviously it's it's still early on, but would be the garage expansion on High Street, that went from a single car garage to a 2-car garage. There is a lot of excavation that's going to be done on that site. There was retaining wall issues with the neighbor. that site is the garages, I believe, on the entirety of that street, basically front the sidewalk. So is that something that, we want to look at as in the future? Was that a good project to use as kind of an example moving forward with that kind of non-conforming use permit use? I think I can't think of any other since I've been here, any other projects.
I was going to suggest if ideas come up, we make a list so that we can see them. I mean, sometimes I feel like the walkability around Kathy Austin's project, Davis, what is it?
Barlow Townhomes.
Barlow Townhomes.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of names over the years, and approving the additional 50 feet or taking away 50 feet of setback from the lagoon and looking to see how that has worked. And then looking at the sense of walkability between the pathway and those units, either now or in the future when we can go into the park that the city owns. That would be another thing on my list.
Yeah, that's a
To
good
just walk and
example.
look
That's
at
one of
it.
the bigger kind of projects that we've looked at in the past few years, I'd say,
Yeah,
that townhouse development.
it'd be nice to take a picture of when the water comes up too. If not that I want that to happen, but if
Yeah.
it did happen, to get a picture of how it relates to where those buildings are.
I don't think it was too close this year.
No, it
fortunately.
hasn't been too close for
Yeah.
a few years,
Yeah.
but
And that was one of the projects that the design review board did go
Mhm,
and
mhm.
view, I believe, a year and a half ago.
Mhm.
So, yes, so the design review board has viewed that. But as far as what the planning commission reviewed and approved, it's, completely different because, yes, as you mentioned, the 50-foot setback buffer, and then a few of the other things as part of that project were kind of, outside of the design review board's scope. So,
If I could too, obviously there's discussion about merging the Planning Commission, Design Review Board, and Tree Board. So if that occurs, then there's a combination of work, responsibility that combines both Design Review and Planning Commission. So it's, looking at design review aspects and looking at land use and development standards, et cetera. And so, we can't speak in advance of that occurring, but it seems like, the city is moving perhaps in that direction. So it would be, I think, helpful to kind of look more comprehensively. I think, kind of looking at these past projects is important. And then also in terms of the PDA grant, when you look at the scope of work, the idea is to look at underutilized parcels, vacant and underutilized parcels. And so as that project goes forward, I'm sure that there are certain parcels in this community that you're very familiar with, and you kind of look at an underutilized or vacant parcel and you think, well, this land use would be appropriate there and that would not be appropriate there. And so it's kind of an opportunity at this time going forward with the PDA grant to really kind of bring that perspective, those perspectives forward so that they can feed into that process. So again, Chair Fritz, we can meet with you for sure and kind of find out more detail about what, you've been thinking about. But as any of you have more comments that we can use to kind of, develop this and develop the walking tours and then feed into the PDA grant, that would be good. And I don't know, do you all have copies of that PDA grant? Do you know kind of the scope of work for that? No.
it's still preliminary. So,
Yeah. It is preliminary, but on the other hand, although preliminary, there is kind of a direction in terms of what the focus might be, and would feed into your walking tour, I think.
Yeah, I think that'd be good to see that.
Yeah, I was going to bring it, same thing. When I go on walks, I see, a couple of properties that are uninhabitable. I mean, that nobody can live in those properties. I'm just wondering, that could be utilized for living space. The other thing is, we've never really, I guess, any projects have come up, but like Fircrest Mobile Home Village, it's been a long time since I walked around there, but I don't know if that would be any of help or, it's usually kind of pretty self-contained.
And then I'm sure that's not really a redevelopment opportunity per se.
Yeah,
'cause they
and I'm
don't-
just kind of,
yeah.
curious. Okay. And then we've also it's always been in the back burner, the south entrance of town. There's some areas there that kind of disjointed, and what we've talked about trying to do something, and it's always been in, kind of a bottom of the list, but might be a good area to kind of walk
Yeah,
around.
it kind of bookends
Yeah.
the Redwood Marketplace and the south end of town and I think that still is in the PDA as well, would be
Yeah.
considered that.
Yeah, it looks at
Yeah.
the kind of whole area. I know we did get a question, I think, in one of the earlier meetings about, that vacant site that's kind of right at the Y where Petaluma and Main Street split, that's been vacant for so long, the old kind of gas station that's been there, and why hasn't anybody developed it yet? And I think there's just, for one, it's an oddly shaped parcel. So site development is kind of key to that. And then also the entrance and exit out of that site could be a little bit difficult because it is, in my eyes, it's really only a right only out from there, because it'd be very difficult to turn left, or you could be waiting there for a long time. So, and then, yeah, we do have some other, vacant sites in town, but I think most of them are residential for the most part. But, any of those other opportunity sites would be, good to look at.
So at this point, are you, as a group, kind of comfortable with, providing, any additional information you may want to at this point? And otherwise, perhaps John and I could meet with the chair and kind of put together basically a tour, some sites where we might stop with some key topics for discussion, and kind of move forward in that direction as a starter in terms of, a walking tour, and perhaps that could be an initial tour. And as we see how that goes, and there are other areas of focus that you would be interested in exploring, we could look at those and do something similar and kind of use this initial tour as a pilot, as a starting point. Is that something that could work?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
I think you're getting a lot of nods, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Then let's move on to our training videos. It appears to just be you and me, Everett.
Welcome to Chapter 1, an introduction to the site plan. Having a complete, accurate, and detailed site plan is critical for determining whether the site plan meets the standards in the ordinance. These requirements include setback regulations, landscaping requirements, and parking standards, to name a few. Also, site plans must meet the submittal specifications required by the zoning ordinance. That is, the scale that the site plan is to be prepared at and the number of copies required for review by the local government body. The site plan review process, when implemented properly, can be one of the most important local government functions in helping to implement the comprehensive master plan. Most state zoning enabling laws allow communities to regulate site plan review through the local zoning ordinance, establishing standards for residential, commercial, and industrial development. In some states, the authority to adopt site plan review standards is presumed to exist. In either case, the purpose of site plan review is to ensure that a proposed development satisfies all standards in the zoning ordinance. Importantly, site plan review can also be used to ensure satisfaction of state and federal regulations as well. The high value of property, the existence of state and federal environmental laws, and the importance of quality of life attributes all mean that a site plan must be professionally prepared. It also must be reviewed by a planning commission and staff that have the knowledge to perform the job. Let's get into Chapter 2 and start learning the answer to the question, what is a site plan? The site plan is a drawing and other documents in accordance with state and local laws that show the layout and arrangement of buildings, uses of land, and other key features of a development site. The site plan will show where buildings are placed, where the parking will happen, key features of the site, such as steep slopes, wetlands, or other key natural features. It'll also show utility connections and how stormwater will be handled on site. The site plan's features are driven by two key influences. First is the property owner or the developer. That individual decides on the placement of buildings, the size of the building that they will need, and other key features of the site. The second main influence of the site plan is the zoning ordinance itself, which sets standards for maximum size of a building or impervious surface on site, required number of parking spaces for a given use. It also might have standards for preservation of key natural features. The property owner and the zoning ordinance influence the ultimate design of the site plan. Projects subject to site plan review are initiated by the property owner, a developer, a business entity, a corporation, etc. The site plan prepared for these individuals is developed and drawn by various professionals. Landscape architects, engineers, and planners with a design credential are among some of the professionals most qualified to prepare site plans. Surveyors and architects might also be professionals that prepare site plans. It is essential that a site plan accepted for review is accurate, drawn to scale, and complete. The potential for long-term impacts from development are so great that an inadequate site plan could miss key design considerations. In other words, the days of submitting hand-drawn, close enough site plans are long gone. Here's our first knowledge question. Why is the scale of a site plan so important? Well, the scale of a site plan must be drawn such that key features of the site can be accurately measured. If the features drawn on the site plan are too small, it will be difficult to determine whether standards in the ordinance are being satisfied. On the other hand, features drawn too large will require a very large site plan that will be difficult to handle and review. A solution would be to require a site plan with a varying scale. For projects of 2 to 3 acres, the scale might be 1 inch equals 20 feet. For sites over that size, maybe the scale is appropriate at 1 inch equals 100 feet. The site includes the entire property, not just that portion of the site where development will occur. For very large sites, perhaps 2 separate plans are required, one showing the entire property and another more detailed plan showing the development on the site. Now that we've briefly reviewed what a site plan is, we'll talk in some more detail about what all is included in a site plan submission. Site plans all have some common features, although the requirements do vary from community to community. Typically, a site plan will show vehicular and pedestrian circulation, locations of buildings and other accessory structures. Certainly, a site plan will show the location of siting, signage, and natural features on site. Detailing all of these elements and how they interface with one another is important in order to understand whether the standards in the ordinance are being met. As noted earlier, having a complete, accurate, and detailed site plan is critical for review. The remaining slides in this chapter will highlight the key features of a site plan that we often see when conducting the site plan review. We'll start with vehicular and pedestrian circulation. Here, a key consideration is emergency access, whether there are no parking fire lanes on the site, other no parking areas to ensure safe access to the building by emergency personnel. These are key features to review related to emergency access. Driveways, another key feature. Where are driveways located in relation to intersections or the street itself? How is parking arranged on site? How does a pedestrian access the parking lot and ultimately the building? These are key considerations when reviewing a site plan for access and mobility. On corner lots, do we see any development in what's called a clear vision triangle? Even the placement of landscaping or signs in a clear vision triangle can be problematic for motorists on the roadways. As main and accessory buildings are the most significant element of a site development, their location in relation to other site plan elements is important to consider. First, the placement of buildings must be in consideration of existing neighboring land uses and buildings. Apart from smaller commercial sites, most zoning ordinances also require the location of separate loading and unloading facilities for commercial and industrial establishments. Examine the site plan and see where these facilities are. Are they in a location away from the ordinary traffic onto and throughout the site? The topography of a site influences development in a significant way. For instance, steep slopes are a key site feature that can result in erosion and other threats to area development. These steep slopes, or topography of the landscape, will be denoted with contour lines and help you understand how this site, once graded and developed, will impact and influence sites on either side. In some instances, slopes can't be avoided, such as hillside or mountain towns. In that case, important engineering considerations will need to be shown on the site plan. Grading and drainage is an important feature of a site plan to see in some detail. Both of these relate to how stormwater will act on the site. Also, it will be important to show natural features on the site, such as woodlands and wetlands. In some communities, they have standards that require that existing natural features be preserved to the extent possible. Perhaps state regulations influence the extent to which existing wetlands can be filled and developed. Other communities might use incentives to encourage developers to preserve these key natural features on the site. Often there's a separate landscape plan that is included as part of the overall site plan. The landscape plan would show existing vegetation that is to be preserved and retained to serve as a screen or buffer around the perimeter of the property. Also, existing vegetation or key natural features can be important to maintain a certain character of the developed site. The landscape plan would also show decorative landscaping in and around the building. While decorative landscaping shown in this landscape plan is not natural, it will be important in order to ensure an overall aesthetic of the proposed project. We might also see on the site plan fencing, landscaping, and other buffers that help to screen certain facilities of the development site, such as unloading areas or waste receptacles. Infrastructure will be detailed on the site plan, including stormwater management systems. Depending on the availability of a municipal stormwater system, the site might include a detention pond focused on retaining water on site before releasing it into the system, or a retention pond that's focused on stormwater infiltrating into the groundwater. The location and size of these systems are largely dictated by the size of the site and the amount of impervious surface. With stormwater, engineering review is incredibly important. Many communities will need to have professional engineers review this aspect of the site plan. Stormwater detention and retention does not need to consist of large concrete structures. More and more communities are adopting green infrastructure standards that require site developers to include bioswales, rain gardens, and other naturally vegetated areas in order to capture and retain that stormwater on site. Other infrastructure we'll see detailed on the site plan would be public utility connections. Often the location of these public utilities on site will be dictated by existing lines and their connection points within the right-of-way. Lighting is another key element of a site plan. All lighting on poles or on the facade of a structure must be detailed on the site plan. Many communities regulate the types of fixtures that can be installed on a site in efforts to minimize impacts on the night sky. It'll be important to review the lighting detail on the site plan to ensure that light does not spill over onto neighboring properties. The location of signs will also be detailed on a site plan. The placement of signs on the site is a health, safety, and welfare consideration, and signs should not be within the setback of the right-of-way or within clear vision triangles. You will often see detail on signage, including the overall size and height of signs on the property. Showing these details, of course, is important for determining ordinance conformance. Site plans also show the proposed project in relation to its surroundings. All buildings, driveways, and existing natural features within a prescribed distance of the site should also be detailed. This will be helpful for the Planning Commission or the zoning administrator when reviewing the project to see how the site interfaces with existing development patterns. Labels will be important in order to determine zoning districts of neighboring properties and their existing uses. Depending on the nature of the project, most site plans will also include supplemental materials. For instance, a project narrative that describes the overall project, the density of the development, and key uses of the site. The project narrative will also include detail on parking and landscaping calculations. Additional materials required in the site plan might also include special studies that the Planning Commission has the authority to request. Perhaps potential impacts of the project are so great that additional studies are warranted, like environmental assessments, wetland determinations, traffic studies, and community impact assessments. Another additional material we sometimes see with site plans are visual aids. Again, for larger projects, the Planning Commission might have the authority to require special computer models or before and after imagery of the site pre-development and post-development. These visual aids are intended to show potential impacts of the site development. We'll talk a bit more about site plan review in Chapter 4. We've talked about what a site plan is and when it's required. Let's now talk about what the site plan review process is all about. Site plan review is the careful evaluation of a drawing proposing development on a given site. The purpose of site plan review is to ensure that the project satisfies all standards in the zoning ordinance and other state and federal laws. Upon approval, the site plan becomes an enforceable document. Therefore, it serves as the basis for any subsequent enforcement inspection. There are many options for establishing a local site plan review process. The process will depend on the state zoning enabling statute, local ordinance, and the availability of local professional staff. On to a knowledge question. Why does a site plan have to be so accurate? The answer: this may be the community's one important chance to review the development to ensure that impacts of that development are not too great on the broader community. Once a site plan is approved, changes to that site plan can only be made by the mutual agreement of the property owner and the Planning Commission. We all like to think we have an eye for design, but one thing site plan review is not is a design workshop. Imagine hearing a statement like this from a planner or zoning administrator. The other night's Planning Commission meeting lasted until 1 a.m. The Planning Commission spent hours discussing the location of a key sign or other feature of the site. If that sounds familiar to you, it's time for a change in your site plan review process. Instead of being so focused on the design of the site, which some planning commissions have gradually become used to doing, the Planning Commission should instead be focused on whether or not the proposed project satisfies the standards in the ordinance. Not only are most planning commissioners unqualified to be site designers, they also lack that authority in their ordinance and in the state law. As I've said, the role of the reviewer is determining satisfaction with the ordinance at hand. Redesigning a site may be enticing to many planning commissioners because they feel reward in knowing that they had a role in locating a key element on that plan. Or in other cases, existing zoning regulations are so poor or so vague that it's hard to determine whether a site plan satisfies the standard. In those cases, a planning commissioner may feel compelled to chime in. Unfortunately, in some communities, the site plan review process has become somewhat of a game, where a developer has learned not to bring forward their best site plan when first being reviewed by the Planning Commission. The thinking is they expect the Planning Commissioner to readjust the plan in various ways, acting again as site designers without the authority. This site plan review game doesn't help either side. The desired process is a transparent one that produces quality development in compliance with the ordinance. Certainly, some large-scale projects can have widespread effects where the Planning Commission feels it's important to limit those spillovers or impacts on neighboring properties. However, the Planning Commission must remember that it is bound by the standards in the ordinance. Only those standards in the ordinance can be the basis for modifying the design of the site plan. In Chapter 5, we'll cover details on when site plan review is required. Welcome to Chapter 5. When is site plan review required? Some zoning enabling acts dictate when a site plan will be required for submission to the local government. The state law might also dictate who reviews that site plan, whether it's staff or an administrative body like the Planning Commission. In Michigan, for example, the Zoning Enabling Act specifies that site plan review is required for special land uses and planned unit developments. For the most part, determining what the site plan review process will be like is left up to the local government, and that shall be specified in the zoning ordinance. There are certain instances where site plan review is not required, often for structures under a certain square footage, for instance, 100 square feet. Also, when there are internal changes proposed to a building. Those would be two examples where site plan review is often not required. As I've said, generally it's local law that establishes when a site plan is required and who will review the site plan. Some local regulations might require site plan review for virtually every new structure proposed on a site. In other communities, it's only large-scale developments like shopping centers or multifamily housing developments that require a site plan. Given these variations, it's important that you understand what your local ordinance requires of the site plan review process. State zoning enabling acts will dictate the flexibility that communities have in who actually does conduct the site plan review. For example, in New Jersey, the site plan review is performed by the planning board, or in some instances, the zoning board of adjustment. In Virginia, site plan review is conducted by any number of administrative bodies, and that review is ministerial, meaning the review is intended to be performed without discretion, and that if it meets standards in the ordinance, it must be approved. It is important to note that some state laws allow a site plan to be submitted directly to a building department with issuance of a building permit. In those cases, this review is purely ministerial, meaning if it meets the minimum standards in the ordinance, the building department must issue the approval. In many instances, however, the site plan is required to be reviewed by the Planning Commission with a formal public hearing. And even in some communities, the legislative body has a role in issuing a final site plan review approval. Most of the time, a formal site plan review for a single-family home or an accessory structure is not required by the zoning ordinance. These plans for construction do, however, require administrative review. That's usually performed by the zoning administrator. Again, whether site plan review is required in the first place and who will review that site plan is largely determined by the state statute and local ordinance. Here's an example excerpt detailing some of the site plan review process requirements we've been discussing. In this example, site plan review by the Planning Commission is required for all uses except detached single-family dwellings, agricultural uses, foster care facilities, and accessory buildings. Those are reviewed by the zoning administrator. Specifications for the site plan will also be detailed in the zoning ordinance. Let's wrap up with a knowledge question. How would you determine if site plan review is required in your community? And if so, what type of development is subject to it? Well, the answer, of course, depends on your local land use regulations. In some cases, this requirement might be embodied in the zoning ordinance. In other instances, it could be in other development regulations, such as subdivision standards, or perhaps even in a municipal code. In any case, local law will establish much of the requirements of the site plan and the process by which it is reviewed. That concludes Chapter 5. When is a site plan required to be reviewed? Here in Chapter 6, let's provide a bit more detail on the overall site plan review process. Depending on your state, the process for site plan review may be detailed in the state zoning enabling statute, or in other communities, it's prescribed in the local ordinance. In New York, for instance, state law requires local governments to make a decision on a site plan within 62 days of receiving a complete application. New York also allows for optional steps in the site plan review process, such as a preliminary meeting with the planning officials. In Michigan, except for special land uses and planned unit developments, the state statute does not prescribe when site plan review is required. So whether a site plan is required or not is left up to each community that administers its own zoning ordinance. The Act also does not detail the process by which a site plan is reviewed. That's a detail left up to locals as well. One thing the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act does require is that the process for site plan review be clearly articulated in the local ordinance. It also specifies that if all standards detailed in the ordinance are met, site plan approval must be granted. A typical site plan review procedure includes 4 important steps: the application, evaluation of that application, the decision, and documentation of the decision. We will go over each of these in a bit of detail, but let me highlight each of these just briefly. The application includes all required materials for the local government to conduct their review. The investigation consists of review of the application and investigating the actual development site. The decision naturally consists of making a determination whether or not the site plan satisfies the standards in the ordinance, and whether it might be appropriate to include conditions with that approval. Documentation of the decision, here we're talking about meeting minutes that accurately capture the discussion, the facts that have been introduced, and the final decision. It's important to note that some states allow for a 2-step process in site plan review. The first stage, referred to as the preliminary review, is intended to hear the developer's overall project concept and to get feedback from the Planning Commission as to whether or not this concept fits with the community's vision for the site. In this case, the Planning Commission is only granting preliminary approval and is including comments for the site developer that will help to keep the project consistent with the community's vision. For instance, there might be the need to reduce the intensity of development on site or locate access to the site in a different way. These types of comments are intended to give the developer a better idea of what the community will ultimately approve. However, any preliminary approval does not relieve the project developer from ultimately getting a final approval of the project. The final step in this 2-part site plan review would be for the project developer to bring a final detailed site plan before the reviewing body. This site plan includes considerably more detail, all the detail required of the ordinance. If then approved by the Planning Commission or the reviewer, the date of approval should be clearly detailed on the site plan. This date of approval is important because some zoning ordinances also set an expiration date, a date by which construction must commence, otherwise site plan approval is null and void. That means the developer will need to come before the reviewer again to get a subsequent site plan approval. The reason for this expiration date is to ensure that the conditions upon which the site plan was approved still exist at this later point in the future. How about a knowledge question now? How can we be sure that other laws that might come into play are met on the plan that's before us? Most zoning ordinances do have statements that read something to the effect that all other applicable laws must be met. In many cases, communities don't have jurisdiction over these other state agency laws or local agency laws. One thing a community can do is to then condition their approval on the site plan on satisfaction of these other laws. Alternatively, a community can try to get the developer to go before other reviewing agencies to get those approvals first. Then the final site plan that is before the Planning Commission is one that shows satisfaction of all those other required laws. That's an overview of the site plan review process. We'll now talk about more specifics of the site plan review application process. An effective and efficient site plan review process begins with an application that is complete. Without a complete application, decisions may be unnecessarily delayed. If not submitted in a timely manner, the review itself may be less than adequate. The key individual in this process is the person that accepts the application for the site plan review. That's usually the zoning administrator. He or she must stand firm in accepting only complete applications and applications by the deadline set by the local government. In this way, the zoning administrator is a gatekeeper of sorts, keeping incomplete or late applications from being considered and only allowing complete and timely applications to come before the reviewer or the reviewing body. Application requirements are prescribed by the local community. There are generally 4 parts of an application. Let's talk about those in detail. The application form is one of those key elements. An application form should minimally include enough detail to know who the applicant is, where the property is located, how to contact the applicant, and what's proposed for the given site. This application form is also a way for the community to communicate information to the property owner. The application can include basic requirements from the ordinance as far as what needs to be submitted for a complete review. Other important information might include the standards by which the review will be conducted. Applications should be submitted in enough time for staff to prepare an analysis of the project, to prepare any mailings that might need to go out for a notice of public hearing, and to prepare a newspaper notification. In short, much needs to happen between the time a complete application is received and the reviewer will review the site plan. It's up to each community to set the appropriate amount of time for this application period. Some communities require that a complete application is submitted as much as 30 days in advance of when the review will be conducted. Other communities might set a deadline of something closer to 7 days. Ultimately, the community must specify this important part of the timeline. As stated, a key part of the application is the property description. This could be a legal description, or perhaps it is a common street address for the community. It would also be helpful to show maps detailing this site in relation to its surroundings. A critical part of the application is the site plan itself. It'll be important for staff to determine that all required elements of the site plan are included in the application before it's accepted. The easiest way to determine that you have a complete site plan is to use a checklist. Here's an example form detailing some preliminary site plan elements that must be provided. This list is, of course, to help to ensure that a complete site plan is submitted. Part of determining a complete application is also whether or not there are enough copies of the site plan submitted. Be sure to get enough copies of the site plan. If your planning commission consists of 7 members, it might be appropriate to require up to 9 site plans be submitted, 1 for each planning commissioner, plus 1 for staff and to keep on file in the local office. If outside reviews of the site plan are to be conducted by consultants or engineers, you'll need additional copies of the site plan. A final key aspect of the application would be the necessary fee or fees required to conduct the review. A fee can be set by a community for all kinds of zoning reviews. The purpose of the fee is to offset or partially offset the costs of conducting the review. It's important that the actual costs in your community are calculated to estimate what this fee will be. Costs might include staff time. Costs could also include per diem or the per meeting payment that you make to planning commissioners. Costs might also include any necessary mailing or noticing in the paper. Fees might also include something known as an escrow fee. This is a fee that's charged in order to get a professional or consultant's review of a site plan that's been submitted. For complex site plans or large projects, you might not have the staff with the background to be able to conduct the review. However, if you require an escrow fee, it'll ensure that the community has the funds on hand in order to contract with a professional who can adequately perform this review. It's important to note that the escrow fee is the applicant's money, and any money that remains after the consultant's review must be returned to the applicant. Let's talk about the pre-application process now. Normally, a potential applicant will contact the community prior to submitting a final site plan. First of all, it's important that the contact be intimately familiar with what's required of a site plan submission and what is specified in the zoning ordinance. Only those persons that have this background should be able to handle these requests coming from applicants. These individuals will need to be able to answer important questions about the submission process. It's not appropriate to guess about answers to these important questions. If this person is not available, defer questions until they are. Questions at this point of the process often relate to what all is included in the review, what are the specifications that must be submitted for the site plan, and what standards will be used in order to determine conformance with the ordinance. This initial contact is important because it sets the tone for the entire site plan review process. As I mentioned, it's important that this contact person know the ordinance inside and out. It might be appropriate for the site plan review process to begin with an official meeting between staff and applicant. By scheduling a meeting, it will allow staff to have information at hand applicable to the project. It's important that staff will provide the applicant with written information as to what the ordinance requires. Or if contact was made over the phone, staff should be sure to send written correspondence in the mail. In all instances, a log should be kept of these preliminary interactions with potential applicants. Also, municipal websites could be detailed with an overview of the site plan application process. Here's a knowledge question to wrap up Chapter 7. Can the Planning Commission look at plans brought to a meeting by an applicant to help determine whether or not the project will be approved or not? If this is not a formal application, this is not advisable. The Planning Commission needs sufficient time in order to understand all of the details of the proposed project. That's the purpose of setting a deadline for submission of a complete application. Giving off-the-cuff comments is not advisable. As we said, however, some communities do have a two-step site plan review process or allow for preliminary meetings. These are only preliminary approvals, however, and never a final site plan determination. We just learned about how important it is to have a complete application before reviewing the site plan. Once a complete application is accepted, that application will be forwarded to the actual decision-making body. This is when decision makers' investigation process begins. The amount of work needed at this point in the process depends a lot on the staff available for the reviewers. If there are professional planners on staff, much of this initial investigation will be conducted by them. Regardless, a thorough investigation process is key for arriving at a final decision. The first investigation step is reviewing the application. After staff has, of course, reviewed the application for completeness, they might take the first crack at determining whether ordinance standards are met. In this case, staff will prepare a report to forward on to the ultimate decision maker. In some cases, that might be the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission will begin their investigation process by not only reviewing the application and the site plan, but also the staff report. Here, at this point, investigation also includes reviewing the appropriate ordinance standards. With all of that information in hand, of course, the next step is examining the site plan itself. Reading a site plan is something of an art, and the more you do it, the more comfortable you will become. One way to get a feel for a site plan is to imagine yourself as a motorist accessing the site, parking your vehicle. Or think of yourself as a pedestrian, getting up and out of the car and approaching the building. You might also imagine yourself as a delivery truck driver or as an employee accessing this site. Somehow think of yourself as an end user of this proposed development. Following the review of the application, the site plan, and the ordinance, next part of the investigation process is a site visit. Reviewing a proposed development by way of a site visit offers a whole different experience than reviewing the project on paper. Site visits are often critical in rendering a good decision. Still, some precautions should be made. For instance, you should never visit a site as a large group. When visiting a site as a group, your state's Open Meetings Act will come into play. Also, there will be important accommodations necessary according to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Instead, it is best to visit a site as an individual, or perhaps visiting the site with staff, someone that is not involved in rendering the ultimate decision. Two cautions with respect to site visits. First, never enter a property without written permission by the property owner. There are a couple of ways you could get this permission. One is to include an affidavit and place for signature on the actual application. In this case, when the applicant signs the application, they're giving permission for government staff to access their property. Alternatively, you could have a separate permission form granting you that access as a local planning official. Another caution is to avoid contact with the property owner or any neighbors when conducting the site. This is referred to as ex parte contact. Ex parte contact means from only one point of view. In other words, you will be advantaged by having information from interacting with the applicant that your fellow planning commissioners do not have. This must be avoided. Due process requires that everyone involved in making a decision is working from the same base level of knowledge. If you are approached by the applicant or neighbors regarding the proposed development, try to minimize conversation and take notes of everything that's said. Then at the public meeting, it'll be important for you to disclose this contact and share all details from your conversation. When conducting the site visit, the details to look for will be prescribed in your zoning ordinance. Typical considerations to examine include traffic considerations, natural features, surrounding land uses and water resources, topography and general neighborhood characteristics as well. Of course, use your own ordinance for referral when conducting this site visit. It may also be helpful to visit the site at different times of day to get a sense of what neighborhood traffic is like. Whatever you do determine when visiting the site, you should share your findings with your fellow planning commissioners. This provides benefit to all. It also might be typical that staff for your jurisdiction takes photographs or videos for sharing during the public meeting. Alternatively, planning commissioners could take pictures of the site as well. Those pictures should be shared with staff so they can be shared with all decision makers involved. Any visual aids that can be used during the meeting will help with deliberation. Of course, the actual standards that you're concerned with are detailed in your ordinance, but the following slides detail some of the general considerations that we're often looking for when conducting site plan review and a site visit. Most ordinances have considerably more detail than the example standards we'll cover now. Site plans should show any significant natural feature that might be present on a site. There are up to 3 approaches to take with these natural features: preservation, integration, or elimination. What the Planning Commission desires at the outcome is somewhat irrelevant. What really matters is if there are standards in the ordinance for any of those 3 outcomes. Check your ordinance to see if you have the backing to require preservation of natural features on site. Compatibility with surrounding land uses is another typical ordinance standard related to site plan review. This is a discretionary standard that has to do with how the proposed development integrates with existing surrounding land uses. If the intensity of the proposed use is significant, the Planning Commission may use this standard in order to condition additional landscaping or screening on site. This screening or buffering would help to mitigate any spillover nuisances to area properties. This standard might also allow the Planning Commission to require screening of dumpsters or of unloading areas on site. Keep in mind that a requirement for additional screening on site may be counter to community goals related to walkability. Another typical standard is one that requires safety considerations for vehicles and pedestrians. This involves the review of circulation patterns and how the site is accessed from the right-of-way or adjacent uses of property. Your community might have important setbacks for parking that relates to this type of standard. For instance, if parking is prohibited in the front setback, this would be something you could identify on the site plan. This setback area would make for appropriate landscaping on site. You'll also be looking for ingress and egress, that is, the driveways to the property. And in some cases, communities might have requirements that sidewalks be completed or multi-use pathways through a site be extended in order to help make up the community's overall bicycle or pedestrian network. Compliance with state or federal regulations related to handicap parking would also relate to this overall standard. I want to briefly mention a standard referred to as access management. It's advisable to require that adjacent properties allow for vehicular and pedestrian movement between those properties without requiring vehicles to go out onto a roadway and then back into an adjacent land use. Shared driveways and access roads would be other examples of access management. The overall goal of access management standards are to minimize traffic and safety concerns. A common misconception is that local communities don't have the authority to dictate where a driveway might be located when fronting a state or county roadway. Although local requirements for driveway location can't conflict with state or county road regulations, the site plan review process can be used to ensure that driveways are located to protect health, safety, and welfare. Another typical standard reviewed during site plan review is adequate access for emergency personnel. Perhaps the best way to ensure that a standard like this is satisfied is to include police or fire authorities in the site plan review process. In many communities, the police and fire chief will review the site plan and send any comments to the reviewing body. Many of the concerns with emergency access relate to vehicle access to the site and access to the building, ensuring that appropriate setbacks are in place. Lighting is another key site design consideration. Lighting should be accurate to illuminate the area, yet not spill over onto neighboring properties. Some ordinances require cutoff fixtures. Those are light fixtures that allow light to only point downward. Here with lighting, you also must consider the lighting of signs, especially signs along the roadway. There are often very important local standards related to stormwater. As I mentioned, most planning commissioners are not adequately trained to review stormwater management plans for a site. Instead, often local consultants or engineers will be asked to review this aspect of a site plan. The important thing is that this professional review happens before the site plan is brought before the Planning Commission. All right, time for another knowledge question. Do we need to accept the recommendations of staff? Decision makers often wonder how much influence should be placed on the review by professional staff that are advising the Planning Commission, as an example. In most cases, your staff or consultants involved in the review process are trained professionals that know how to conduct this review. Their job is to provide you with a professional opinion. Their recommendations should be supported by facts and the standards that are appropriate for the case at hand. It is true that their view of facts and the standards may be different than yours. And ultimately, if the site plan is to be approved by an administrative body like the Planning Commission, the decision is that of the planning commissioners. That said, staff recommendations should carry weight. Importantly, if you're seeking the recommendation of an attorney or asking for a legal opinion, in that instance, that legal opinion should be followed. Now I'd like to share a comment from Steve Langworthy, retired senior project planner with the City of Grand Rapids. Pause the video and read Steve's comments regarding site plan review. Chapter 9 is all about making the actual decision about a proposed site plan. Carefully following a consistent process is one of the most important things to remember. Consistency of the process and following the standards in the ordinance help to keep a decision from being rendered arbitrary and capricious by the courts. Regarding a consistent process, as you review each site plan, you may find it advantageous to review each applicable standard in turn. This will ensure consistency, and consistency will be aided by use of a checklist as well. A checklist that's tailored to the standards of your ordinance. In addition to a consistent process, as we've mentioned, equally important is to base your decision on ordinance standards and ordinance standards alone. The standards that you use to reach your decision must be written in the zoning ordinance. As we've stated, if all applicable standards are met with the application before you, approval must be granted. If it ever seems the Planning Commission is unsure whether a particular standard is satisfied, then don't render a decision that evening. Planning commissioners have the authority to postpone their decisions, so long as that postponement is in order to gain additional insights in the decision. For instance, maybe additional information is needed from staff, or maybe there's a special study that needs to be performed. That said, delay for the sake of delay could result in a lawsuit. In many cases, when the Planning Commission is reviewing a site plan, there may also be the requirement for a public hearing. One of the challenges of public being involved in the site plan review process is that they may not understand that the decision the Planning Commission reaches regarding the site plan may have little to do with whether the use is ever approved for that location. Often, site plan review is treated as a separate decision than the actual permitting of the use on site. In Michigan, there's an example of this with the special land use permit that also requires a separate site plan review decision. The challenge is, though, the public may be solely focused on not wanting the use established there in the first place. Perhaps this dilemma can be eased by the Planning Commission chair stating what the role of the Planning Commission is regarding site plan review only. The chairman could go further and state that if all applicable standards in the ordinance are satisfied by the site plan, approval must be given. Simply put, a room full of angry people who oppose a decision is not a reason for denying the application. As we've stated, approvals or denials must be adequately supported by the facts. Zoning cannot be a popularity contest. If it was, it would only take one planning commissioner to arrive at a decision. That individual would simply need to count the number of hands in the audience in support or denial of the project. Ultimately, the appropriate role of the public is to provide information to the decision makers. Neighbors of the proposed project may be able to provide important insights into the neighborhood. Perhaps neighbor comments help to identify the need for an important study about the impacts of the proposed use. Ultimately, the Planning Commission must decide which comments made by the public are considered facts relevant to the case. All right, time for another knowledge question. Can the Planning Commission request things of the applicant that aren't specified in the zoning ordinance? You can always ask, but remember, if the application satisfies the standards in the ordinance, approval must be granted. In many instances, there's little authority that would allow the Planning Commission to request additional information from the applicant. Where there is a discretionary standard or the ordinance is vague, it may be better to fix the ordinance at a later point in time than to try to coerce more information out of the applicant. On the other hand, if the Planning Commission feels there's an aspect of the project that they're just not comfortable with, the applicant may be persuaded to be able to provide additional information to help the Planning Commission arrive at their decision. But as we said, don't contribute to the zoning game or get overly involved in site design. Your job is to uphold the standards of the ordinance. Here in Chapter 10, we'll talk about how critically important it is to sufficiently document your decisions. In these days of increasing litigation and public scrutiny on local government, it's not enough to approve or deny an application just based on some vague notion of whether the project is good or bad. The record must show sufficient facts that back up the findings of the Planning Commission. For example, if there are concerns about traffic in an area and the location of a driveway, these facts must be detailed. It'll be important to have traffic counts or perhaps accident counts for the location. If a decision is challenged, the importance of using ordinance standards to base the decision becomes evident. A complete record of the facts in the case and how those facts relate to standards in the ordinance will be important to uphold your decision if ever challenged in court. Once a project is under construction with an approved site plan, it may be necessary, and often is likely, that modifications will be needed to the site plan. In this case, an amended site plan is required, an amended site plan that is agreed to by both the applicant and the Planning Commission. Again, the date of this amended site plan should be clearly written on the site plan itself. Your ordinance might also specify a date beyond which site plan approval is null and void. That means construction must begin within a specified period of time for that approval to be valid. In some communities, they do allow for extensions to site plan approvals. Let's talk a bit about conditions of approval with respect to site plans. The approving body may attach conditions to a site plan approval. Those conditions must be reasonably related to the standards in the ordinance. In practice, site plans are rarely ever denied. Often, conditions will help to move a site plan from not meeting ordinance standards to sufficiently meeting ordinance standards and therefore being approved. Or if that site plan lacks sufficient detail for approval to be granted, it would be wise to delay decision on that site plan until it does meet ordinance requirements. Importantly, a site plan, when approved, does become part of the local government's permanent record. That approved site plan will be used in order to inspect the site during construction and at points in the future if enforcement is ever an issue. With the potential for multiple versions of a site plan to exist through the review process, it's critical that the final approved site plan or the amended site plan is signed and dated by both the applicant and the reviewing body or official. Here's another knowledge question. Do we have to hold a public hearing during site plan review? Your state's land use enabling laws will dictate if public hearings are required as part of site plan review. In most states, whether to hold a public hearing or not is left to the discretion of the local community. Under Connecticut statute, there's no requirement that site plan review include a public hearing. Instead, local regulations determine when a public hearing is required. When a local ordinance does prescribe a public hearing, that ordinance should also describe what is required in noticing that public hearing. Here we're talking about mailings to area property owners and noticing in a newspaper of general circulation. In Michigan, a public hearing is required for special land uses that require a site plan and for plan unit developments that also require a site plan to be submitted. During public hearings, a dilemma that many planning commissioners face is whether to put weight on the comments made by the public. As we've said before, the public may introduce important information for consideration. However, public that simply opposes the project offers little to inform the planning commissioner on satisfaction of ordinance standards. It's the job of the planning commissioner to take those public comments and only use the information that's pertinent to rendering a decision regarding the standards in the case. Often staff can help with this. Let's cover post-decision documentation. The applicant and the secretary or the chair of the planning commission should date and sign 2 to 3 copies of the site plan. The applicant would keep one of these for his or own use, and the local government would keep the other 2 on file for future use. It's important for copies of the minutes of the meeting also to be sent to the applicant. Of course, these would be kept on file by the local government as well. Also, in most communities, post-decision documentation also includes issuance of a letter to the applicant stating that the site plan was approved with conditions, or denied, and if denied, stating the specific reasons for that denial. This letter would also instruct the applicant whether additional approvals are required. For instance, whether they need to visit the Zoning Board of Appeals to seek a dimensional variance, as one example. Once approved, project files for site plans should include, at a minimum, relevant pages of the minutes from the meeting at which the site plan was decided, staff notes, meeting notes, correspondence, and all application materials. Finally, the approved and signed copy of the site plan. Let's now explore the activity for Course 9. Examine the site plan shown here. Consider the features called out in boxes A through F. For each of those features, make notes about possible concerns that you have and potential standards that might relate to those elements in the site plan. Pause the video now to complete the activity yourself.
I'd say we, unless you want to keep going. Yeah, I'd say we just keep going.
I'll first talk about areas A and F on the site plan. Here, we're probably thinking about concerns that have to do with compatibility with surrounding land uses. Also, maybe there's standards that relate to access management, for instance, shared driveways or shared parking areas. These areas on the perimeter of the property might also be areas where natural features should be retained in order to offer screening of neighboring properties or to give the site a unique sense of character. Elements B, C, and E probably relate mostly to circulation and safety of pedestrians and vehicles in and out of the site. Looking at areas A and B on the site, you might be thinking about signage and how motorists might navigate this space when first entering the property. Site plan elements here, B and C, you might notice that there's 90-degree or perpendicular parking mixed with angled parking. This might be confusing to motorists and create some conflicts with vehicles backing out. Element E, are the driveways properly located according to standards in your ordinance? I also see element E and D and wonder about emergency vehicle access onto the property and access to the building. Is there a fire lane where no parking should be allowed? How about drainage on site? Areas of the site plan B, C, and F would be areas to think about drainage and stormwater management. Lastly, there's a lot of asphalt on this property, a lot of parking spaces, the potential for a lot of vehicles moving through here. Would we need an engineer to review this plan in order to determine conformance with the ordinance standards? That might be the case in your ordinance for your community. With the conclusion of Course 9, you should now be able to determine which projects require site plan review, the required elements of a site plan, and the actual site plan review process applicable to your community. This concludes Course 9 of Planning Commissioner Training. Thanks for watching.
What's that? Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Did you have any comments or questions about that? I had a question. Yeah, because the way he's kind of describing this sounds like this kind of usually two-step process of like a site plan review and then other use kind of permit review. And we definitely don't do that here. I'm just wondering if that is like a jurisdiction by jurisdiction thing, or is that a state thing? Does the state of California provide for, site plan review and separate from?
I think what's more common is that you receive a complete set of application materials. So the site plan is one aspect of a complete application. So oftentimes, as you well know, there is a site plan, oftentimes a preliminary grading and drainage plan, elevations, rough floor plans. So the site plan really is one aspect, one component of a complete set of plans for a project. But in a way, what he described here for the site plan review is generally applicable for the other plans in that package. So, for example, the elevations. We know that, for example, the zoning code is going to have development standards in terms of building height, maybe objective design standards for offsets, et cetera. So again, as mentioned here many times, the foundation is your state implementing code and your local ordinance requirements. So the site plan is one of several plan sheets that we typically receive, but in all cases, there are code requirements that our staff uses to review those plans and then provide a recommendation to the commission. So this is very helpful, but it's just one of many. A few things too that I noticed just quickly. He mentioned, for example, this idea that if the site plan meets the requirements of the code, it must or shall be adopted. I think there's some nuances to that. And for example, as you know, in the work of the city, I'll say, and maybe this is more design review, the design review board, tree board. And I really think, and I know there's discussion around this already, but that sort of review should be earlier in the process because, for example, tree preservations. Most communities have tree ordinances and require some level of tree preservation and or replacement. So in terms of, a site plan review, that area of review for tree preservation, there's some discretion there. And it can affect placement of buildings and how many buildings, et cetera. So it's not absolute. There are areas of somewhat discretion. So I would take some exception with that comment because I think that, I think tree preservation comes to mind, for example. I also think that this idea of conceptual review or preliminary review for larger, more complex applications is very, very important. And we as staff encourage pre-application meetings to try to share information and whatnot. But for more major projects, in my experience, I think having the applicant share conceptually a plan, a concept with some details to the planning commission or design review board entity is helpful to get that feedback. Again, as he stated, it's preliminary, it's not final, but I think for all parties involved, it's very, very useful because sometimes what we end up getting is an application, preliminary drawings really, but the architect, landscape architect, applicant really are somewhat locked in, and there hasn't been the benefit of early review. And I think on more major projects, that's pretty important, very important, I would say.
I think sometimes the problem with that becomes if there's too much of a delay between the preliminary review and the actual application, like the whole composition of the board can change. And then you get like a board that gave you some comments on preliminary review, and then you can't control that, but especially for bigger projects. And I'm thinking the canopy, when we first saw the canopy was many years ago. And I think maybe you and I were the only ones on the commission, maybe Kathy at the time. But, then we see the final and, half of the commission may not have even seen the preliminary review before. So it's, sometimes things can get kind of wonky that way.
That's a good point, but I would hope, generally speaking, that the developer applicant is ready and, has the capital and is able to kind of move forward. And in those circumstances, I think that pre-application review, not just with staff, but a decision, an advisory body, better said, is very useful.
Mhm.
So that then they can take your feedback, I'll say, staff feedback, put it together, and then submit. And my experience generally has been that's very useful and actually overall streamlines the process. But that's assuming you have an applicant that's financed and kind of ready to go,
Mhm.
and the staff and advisory decision-making bodies are, set to go too.
Mhm.
Anyway, I still kind of stand by that.
No, I agree. And I agree as an architect, I find it very useful to do that preliminary review to get, early feedback before things get locked in too much. I think it's definitely useful. I also thought it was interesting. I mean, kind of similar to your point, I think it's important for us to also realize, for now at least, that we aren't the design review board, that we are, there is another entity that is doing the design, although that may be changing. But sometimes when we're reviewing a project, you kind of, I'm an architect, I have certainly opinions about the design. It's kind of sometimes hard to hold some of those back and just kind of focus on like what is our scope and what is our purview as the planning commission, rather than a design review board kind of body.
Understood. I think that would be challenging. I'm hopeful for
Yeah.
the city really that as the city moves forward with this, I'll refer to it again as reorganization, that the various aspects of development and review can be brought together, and that the design review tree board component can be done more early in the process, perhaps with larger projects with the benefit of early review, pre-application review, or conceptual review. And I think it'll be a more streamlined, more predictable process overall, if that occurs.
I also thought one of the things he said was interesting about the just like public comment and how you're trying to stay objective through that and trying to, again, like understand what your purview is. And, some projects elicit a lot of passion in the community. And sometimes you can, definitely feel that up here. And it's just sometimes, it's important, I think, for us to try to stay objective and, take the comments, as they are. And sometimes they are important, they're always important to hear, but sometimes, and the canopy is an example, like, I think objectively we felt that it was a good project and it complied with the standards and we approved it, even though there's a lot of, public member opposition to it. And sometimes it's hard to be in that position.
It's a challenging position for, say, the planning commission or design review body, because you are looking at the code and adopted policies. And guidance has been given to the applicant and applicant representatives to, comply with code requirements and adopted policy. And that's your guide too. And you're in that awkward position where you're trying to enforce the code, adopted code, and vision of the community, and at the same time hear and be responsive to the community. It's not easy. And there are times when you kind of make some adjustments to try to address issues and concerns, but fundamentally you have adopted policy and code that has to guide you, and it's challenging. No
Yeah,
question.
and that always needs to be explained,
Yeah.
at the meetings, to say, this is what we're here for, this is what we can do, this is what we can't, so I think that helps.
Yeah.
It does.
Yeah. Commissioner Ever has a suggestion that I agree with. I would like to postpone the second hearing since there's only two of us here. The second training, since there's only two of us. And I would like to, and I don't know if this should come from staff or me, but suggest that the three absent commissioners watch this video, on replay. Just I think there was some useful information there that, only two of the three got, or two of the five of us got. So I can either send an email to them, or if staff wants to send an email suggesting they either get the login or just watch the recording of the meeting, I guess would be fine too.
Why don't we do that as staff? We'll be happy to do that.
Okay. Appreciate that. So then we're moving on to subcommittee updates. I don't think we have any subcommittees between the two of us to talk about. Is there any planning director's report?
Not really a prepared report, other than, I did provide the commission with some training information in the past, soon after I arrived here. And I think as the city kind of decides on the reorganization aspects of the various commissions, committees, boards, it would be a good idea to maybe pick that up, that series that I provided to you, and think about, further trainings. We can pick up this next one here, as well as some of those that I forwarded to you. So I think the trainings are useful, and maybe one, occasionally, as you have a meeting agenda that's kind of light, would be a good idea. I mean, I thought tonight, for example, this was very, very useful. I mean, I've heard this kind of information often, and I'm sure all of us have over the years, but it's always helpful to kind of reinforce and be refreshed, I think. So going forward, I would like to continue the trainings.
I'm 100% behind that.
Okay.
And then just in terms of upcoming meetings, so next 2 weeks we have a meeting, something to review, or?
Yes, we do. We will have two items. So the first item will be a use permit request from Luma Optics. They're looking at occupying the Bohemian Stoneworks building. So that is a non-conforming use currently right now. So they are as light industrial. So they're looking at continuing that light industrial use for their kind of warehouse operations that they're going to be proposing for that space. And then the second item is the capital improvement plan, general plan consistency that is reported by the, it's kind of planning director and city engineer. So that will go over kind of the CIP projects for the next, I think it's 5 years. And then the associated budgets and stuff like that with those projects.
And you no doubt have done that before in terms of, the consistency determination. So the staff report is prepared. That'll come to you at your meeting on June 25th, I believe it is. And the idea is we'll run through a number of projects that I'm sure you're familiar with the process, and kind of point out how staff believes that they are consistent with general plan policies, and be looking for your consistency determination, which would then be passed on to the city council as the city council goes forward to adopt the budget and the capital improvement program.
Thank you. Any questions? I actually just went back to my Zoom screen. I see we have a hand raised. Should I have taken comments on our training video? I wasn't planning on doing that. Or do we need
Sure.
to? I believe that's still Linda. Is that you, Linda? Do you want to make a public comment on that training video? Sorry, I didn't see your hand raised before.
Hear me?
Yes, we can.
On the subject of the walk, I thought that was interesting that you are thinking about coming up and checking out the Redwood Marketplace. And so, I think that's really a great idea. And so when you do, I am suggesting that you make it sort of holistic. And part of that walk is I want you to come across the road and walk through the on the sidewalk there near the Rise and Shine, and take a look at it. Oftentimes they have aggressive dogs that are off the leash, a lot of trash there, and then also part of that little walk, just go around the corner there to the liquor store, which has been broken in and now has bars on its door. But there are also some encampments that are on the corner on the liquor store property of people that are hunkered down and been there for weeks. And there's a lot of trash there. Feel free to talk to some of these people. That I tell you, they have very interesting stories. And go across the street and over to the marketplace. And then part of your walk there, not only do I want you to talk to the people at the Lucky's, the clerks, go in and talk to Julia, who has managed the thrift store there for 16 years. Go on over, of course, to the hardware store and talk to their clerks. Ask them about the theft and the impact that this RV villagers have had in their businesses and themselves. How then also go behind mosey on behind the marketplace buildings there, and you'll see that there's been broken into gates that say no trespassing. There's a path back there, and when more people camping out, go behind on the other side, and you'll see the dumpsters and all kinds of like the containers and stuff have been broken into, and the stuff from the thrift store, people drop things off behind the thrift store routinely.
Linda, you have about 30 seconds left.
That gets stolen. Also, I'd just like to mention that I know these people, and one of them is a repeat violator. 15 times he's been arrested and in prison, and he's also an arsonist who is responsible for that trailer fire. These are the people that Jack Tibbet plans to house here permanently. 3 properties from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
And with that, I will adjourn us for 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.
We're done.